This is part 2 of Diego Calderón Franco's story, an account of what transpired for Diego, FARC members, and Colombia as a whole in the years following his kidnapping. We recommend you listen to part 1 of Diego's story before continuing with this episode.
We go to his shop, and there was like 3 or 4 more guys working there in the sewing machines, in the stitching machines. So we come in, and in that moment, I recognize him. He comes to just greet us because he's the chief of the shop. And then, I keep looking at his eyes, and he's looking at my eyes, and I said, like, mate, you remember me?
When I reached out to Diego to talk to him about his kidnapping by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as the FARC, I had no idea that he would actually be telling me he was still in touch with the same people who took him back in 2004. But this time, the relationship between FARC soldiers and Diego was different. They were working together with a shared objective to build a bridge between ex-guerrilla soldiers and the everyday ordinary citizens of Colombia. I'm Katie Mihalich, and you're listening to Shadow Clock. After being released by the FARC, Diego fell back into his normal life fairly quickly, and by 2007, he even started his own tourism company.
I came out of the kidnapping, I finished biology, and I started to work on tourism, on bird watching tourism. So I kept breathing, thinking, doing birds. And then I've been in the field. I've been seeing Colombia and going deeper into Colombia and seeing, the campesinos and the people that help us, finding the birds and everything.
What Diego means is that he hires local people to assist in his birdwatching tours, something that helps both himself and the communities he works within. His company creates much-needed jobs, and in turn, Diego has access to trustworthy co-guides who know the lay of the land. If you remember from part 1 of Diego's story, I mentioned that in 2016, the Colombian peace agreement was signed between the Colombian government and the FARC. This agreement allowed ex-guerrilla members to assimilate back into society without prosecution or repercussions. When voting on whether or not the referendum should pass, the people of Colombia were nearly split 50-50 down the middle. The votes to pass the referendum actually failed. After mass amounts of public protests and much negotiating between the FARC and government officials, both for and against the peace deal, a peace agreement was finally signed. However, agreement or not, the country stood divided, and Diego, who had never considered himself very politically engaged, began to feel drawn to the political divide personally, both before the signing and after.
I've never been a very social person in the context of joining or volunteering big causes to help this church or this hospital or bringing food to people, that kind of stuff. But then 2016, when we have the possibility as a country to decide on voting as the referendum for the peace deal in Colombia that we were signing with FARC, I got super curious. I got, a feeling that I've never got before, like what each Colombian should be doing that is in her hands to just help, to just collaborate with the cause.
For Diego, his opportunity to collaborate with this cause all started after a conversation with a friend, Juan Fernandez Diaz Nieto. Juan is a professor of biology at EAFIT University in Medellin, and he told Diego that Colombia's government was starting a program called Expedición Bio. I'm going to have Diego explain to you what it is.
Expedición Bio is this program by the government that after we signed the peace deal with FARC, the government put some money to go and do biological explorations to areas that were out of reach because of the conflict, areas that were with FARC guerrilla groups. So after we got all the guerrilla groups, almost all the guerrilla groups from FARC out of the field, the government said, okay, let's explore it. Let's go and see what surprises we have in those areas. Because one thing that is not a secret is that the conflict helped to conserve, to protect, to really keep those areas preserved in a way.
meaning much of the land that had been taken over by guerrilla groups was untouched by cattle ranching and agriculture and virtually unexplored. And who better to teach about the land but former guerrilla members themselves, who knew the terrain inside and out. It was over a beer that Juan told Diego he was actually heading one of these expeditions with former FARC soldiers. The idea was to pair up former guerrilla members with the scientific community and explore the now accessible territory together.
I told Juancho, my friend, like, man, you have to invite me. You know, I want to go. You know that in all this, like this quest I've got in the last 2 years to really do something, this is what I want to do. I want to go and work with FARC guerrilla ex-soldiers, ex-fighters together. What else could I do? I mean, like, I'm a victim, supposedly. I don't like that title because I think is a title forever. I was a victim for a few days, but I don't consider myself today a victim. But anyways, I was kidnapped by these guys, and these guys have taken the brave decision to leave the guns, to leave the field, to leave the jungle, and come out and try to reintegrate into society. The very best, most beautiful and profound, honest thing I want to do is just going and work with them, teaching them a tiny bit I know about birds and learning a lot about what they know about the forest and the birds.
And so, in the spring of 2017, a group of people made up of mostly Colombian citizens from all walks of life set out together to learn from one another.
So the beautiful thing is that this was like a social cultural experiment to really show people that nowadays we can get these very, very two, let's say, distant parts of society that were not able to mix together a few years ago. And nowadays, because we signed the peace deal with FARC, we have the privilege and we have the beautiful opportunity to make them work together and produce beautiful, in this case, biological information, of an area that the guerrilla used to know very well because they used to live there, and that their biologists were drooling to go and explore because it was out of reach because of the conflict. Ex-guerrilla fighters, local farmers, students from private, upscale, wealthy universities from Medellin, researchers, professors, international people from the United Nations Verification Committee, etc., etc. We made this absolutely beautiful mixture of what is Colombia, a mixture of like all the tones of gray you have in between black and white. And we went just to have fun, to research the animals and the plants. And of course, we did a neat job. We found a new palm for science, a new mouse, 3 new orchids, a new lizard, like 10 or 20 new beetles and insects, blah, 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 tons of stuff. But that's just accessory.
Of course, the new discoveries of the various species of plants and animals were amazing. But as Diego described the expedition, it became clear he meant what he said. The scientific discoveries were simply just secondary to what was unfolding between the people working together. He told me about a man named Juan Carlos and a girl named Sarah, and his description of Juan Carlos and Sarah interacting really struck me.
One day, we got together an ex-FARC soldier, Juan Carlos El Barbao, that was actually a campesino, peasant. 25 years ago, he decided to go into guerrilla because whatever, and we sat him with Sarah. And Sarah is a very young student from a rich university. And with all due respect and with all the love I have for Sarah, she just got all the privilege, all the opportunities just at her hands. And that's okay. That's the life she didn't choose to have, but she had it. But we sat her just next to our bow to chat about life, about dreams, about Colombian history, about family, about birds, just while they were waiting for birds and just getting the birds and measuring them and photographing them. This was the most beautiful thing in recent Colombian history, and we were part of it.
The interaction between Juan Carlos and Sarah stuck with Diego, and it ignited a desire to reach out and find some of the former FARC soldiers who had kidnapped him when he was a student.
So I wanted a lot to visit them. The ex-FARC soldiers from the Front 41 that kidnapped me, to just get to do what Sarah did with one of these ex-guerrilla fighters just to talk about life. What's their view of the peace agreement? What are their hopes? What are their dreams? What they're doing? I mean, they were as victims of the conflict as I was. It was their decision to go into FARC, but they were also kidnapped. They didn't have a life. They were just suffering as much.
Through the work Diego was doing with Expedición Bio, he began to make connections with people who eventually helped him locate some of the former members of the Front 41, the specific FARC group who had kidnapped him.
So I went to visit these guys, and I got to see 2-3 people that I was actually there kidnapped by.
If you remember from part 1 of Diego's story, he mentioned several guards watched over him at night and during the day. Aileen was one of them, and when he saw her for the first time, 13 years after his kidnapping, he recognized her right away.
I went and I got into this camp where these guys are living. That's not a camp, really. It's like a small city. And I just knock on this door, and it comes Aileen. Very, very same smile. Very beautiful, sharp, shining eyes than 15 years ago. So she invites me to a little drink at her house. We sat, chat for a couple of hours. I learned that she's managing the local projects of the, groceries and vegetables production. She has a kid. She decided to have a kid, something that is absolutely beautiful from the peace process. All these women have decided to have kids because they wanted that so much, and that anchors them to the ground, to the territory, that allows them to root in the territory, to have kids. I don't particularly believe that, overpopulation is a good thing, but all these kids, all this baby boom by the FARC, I think is just beautiful, beautiful. It's just these people having a fucking life, having opportunities that they've never got before. It's just beautiful. I mean, and Aileen was a minor when I was kidnapped. She had no fucking idea what she was doing there in FARC. She had joined just because it was the option that she saw. Like the guys that, one day were camping in front of her house, and she was having a shitty life in her family. She was not being treated well, and, probably some intrafamiliar violence and stuff. And she just decided to run away from that. And when she decided to run away from that, the Colombian government, the Colombian state wasn't there. It was not police, it was no army, there was no church, there was no, a nurse in a hospital. The only people that was there was FARC, and she joined FARC. And then 15 years later, I went to see her, and she's absolutely in disbelief that I was kidnapped by her group. I was there, just willing to know if she's doing okay. So that's, making this long story short, that's how I got to Omar. Because talking with everyone, Omar came to conversation, and, oh shit, yeah, Omar, I do remember him, blah, blah. And they said, yeah, Omar is not here in this camp. Omar is in another camp.
If you remember, Omar was the FARC soldier who Diego described as the jungle man, the man that knew everything. He was the guy Diego often walked closely behind to observe how Omar moved throughout the forest while tracking and following the trails. He was also the soldier who was tasked with bringing Diego down the mountain and back to freedom. Here's some pulled audio taken from the first episode in which Diego describes one of his last interactions with Omar.
So I'm sleeping in the barn in a little whatever shed with some blankets and sheets and stuff. It's okay. But then Omar comes to me and kind of knocks the door and comes in and says, hey, Diego, take it easy, mate. Remember, you're free. You're going to be free the day after tomorrow. We're just taking you to freedom. It's okay. So I, in a way, actually, I felt him like an uncle coming to give me advice on a lovely way. Pretty touching, pretty powerful.
Diego asked some people in charge at Aileen's camp if they could help arrange a trip to the settlement where Omar was living. Upon arriving to Omar's village, those facilitating the visit took Diego to a shop.
We got to his shop, and there was 3 or 4 more guys working there in the sewing machines, in the stitching machines. So we come in, and in that moment, I recognize him. He comes to just greet us because he's the chief of the shop. And then, I keep looking at his eyes and he's looking at my eyes, and I said, like, mate, remember me? And he on this little sarcastic, but trying, I don't know what was he looking for, but he was probably trying to get 2 more seconds of not facing this situation that is a little uncomfortable anyways. He says, like, no, I don't remember you. But he's kind of a little cheeky laughing, He's like totally sarcastic. And I'm like, come on, fucker. Come on. I told him like that in Spanish, like with a bad word that is very normal in between us, that is actually very close, like bad words that I would use with my friends. I told him, come on, Weon, like, you have to remember me. And he just kind of laughed. And we just shake hands and have a big hug. And then he showed us around the shop, and then we just had coffee and sat for 2 hours to talk about life, about what's happened, and about why he joined FARC several years ago. I got to know his story. I never heard it when I was kidnapped, of course. We never talk about that. And just to hang out with another cool chap, another cool neighbor, That chap is just another basic Colombian campesino. He's just a farmer, he's just a peasant that one day took the wrong decision, actually forced by the situation, and joined a guerrilla group and worked with that guerrilla group for 10, 15, 20 years. But nowadays, Omar is just as any other basic Colombian at the base of the chain, is just trying to survive. He's the chief, and they make clothing, they do uniforms, and they do stuff for hospitals for kids. And Omar is the chief of that little shop.
I was curious, as trite as it sounds, if anyone had mentioned or attempted any kind of apology.
I'm curious, did they feel like they needed to say they were sorry? Because it's clear, I sense in your energy, you were not looking for an apology.
I wasn't looking for it. And I met 3 people that I was, that I had met 15 years ago in the kidnapping. That's Omar, that's Eileen, and Patricia, another lady that she was also in those days when we were kidnapped. None of them told me that they were sorry. None of them felt the need to, in that moment, at least in that first meeting that we had. And I wasn't looking for it, so I didn't even pay attention to it. But I think there is also a couple of things. One is the fact that a lot of these guys were trained a lot mentally when they were belonging to FARC on why they were there. So some of them were really, really believing that story, that excuse that FARC used to have for these actions. And probably some of them, they are sorry to have caused so much damage and so much pain and so much tears to the Colombian people and society. In some of these specific cases, they could even think like, fuck, we were ordered to do it. I mean, like they were receiving orders, they were following orders.
Just as a reminder, the ideology FARC soldiers were fighting for, or at least what they were told they were fighting for, was equity and social justice for the poor, and to protect the people from government violence. Unfortunately, the actions they took to do so were as unjust as what they were fighting against to begin with.
So that's my understanding, too, is I feel the way you tell the story that it's almost like you're 2 victims, but I know you don't like this word, and I don't feel like you're a victim, but you're both experiencing the same thing from different sides.
Exactly. All these guerrilla fighters have been victims of the conflict in Colombia. That's simple. That's simple. 99% of the guerrilla fighters come from rural areas where campesinos, they didn't have options. They have either right-wing paramilitary groups, or in the older times of violence, they have the government just, killing them and pressuring them. And the only escape that they found was joining FARC or any other guerrilla group. But they are as victims as the ones that were kidnapped and the ones that were killed, and just victims, more victims. Of course, I'm not talking about the commanders, and I'm not talking about the big chiefs and all the big motherfuckers, but I'm telling you about the simple, basic Colombian chaps that were part of FARC. I'm a person that I think you don't need to carry stuff that is not useful to build. I've never been keeping and having bad feelings against FARC, against those guys that kidnapped me, those basic guerrilla fighters. They were receiving orders, they were following orders. So, bad feelings and all this bad energy, I think is just useless, So one of the things is that I saw Omar and I didn't even need it to forgive him for being one of the guys that kidnapped me. I was just so happy to learn and see that he got away, that he's just having a new life, and that he's blessing every second of his life that this war ended for him and for several other Colombians, and that he's doing something to just earn his money and his life, and he's just behaving like a normal, citizen. It's just beautiful.
Diego took his experience of reconnecting with the FARC and decided to do something powerful.
Something that I've been discovering is that birds are such a beautiful bridge to connect anyone and anything. So I made up this crazy thing, that is this talk, this presentation that is named Birding with FARC, how birds connect people. And it's getting people uncomfortable and getting them away from their comfort zone and their bubbles with a lot of love. And it's showing them that the reality is not white or black, that there is tons of grays.
He began touring college campuses and other organizations to share his story, giving listeners a perspective from someone who has seen both sides of the conflict up close and personal. His audiences are made up of people who voted for and against the peace agreement, and he challenges them to think about how people from vastly different backgrounds can work together to find peace.
I've sat people that believe in the peace accord and voted yes, and people that didn't believe in the peace accord and voted not. I have sat them in the same room to listen for 1 hour to this story that basically I was a student and I was kidnapped, and getting them in context. So in that half of the talk, the people that is with me is absolutely melted. It's like, oh shit, this guy was kidnapped and blah, blah. The people that is not with me, the people that is not with the peace agreement, the people that is probably reinforcing a little bit their views that this has been a shitty country that has been affected by the conflict, and the bad guys, they are probably reinforcing that a little bit. Then from the middle of the talk onwards, I tell them, with tons of love, because what I do in this talk is just hugging people, telling them my story. It's like all these beautiful things that have been able to happen in Colombia after the peace deal.
And that's when Diego explains his participation with Expedición Bio and working side by side with former FARC members in the field, exploring birds and nature. Of course, Diego touches upon the awesome findings made during the expedition, such as the new species of beetles, orchids, and mice. But clearly those discoveries are not the focus of Diego's talk. It's the intrapersonal discoveries Diego has made about how he views his country and its people that have motivated him to publicly speak out. He shares the story of watching Sarah, the student, and Juan Carlos, the ex-soldier, connecting over birds, about his own experiences working with ex-FARC on the expedition, about reconnecting with Eileen and Omar. He talks of the importance of forgiveness and the need for Colombians to work together to make the peace agreement a success. The process hasn't been easy. Even though the agreement is signed and intact, more than 200 former ex-FARC soldiers who signed the peace deal have been killed by far-right groups who oppose the peace agreement.
The two main challenges that we have are just preserving these people's lives, and the other thing is just, as a society, just offering them opportunities and getting people to understand that, what they've been watching from the comfortability of their television is not the real Colombia. The real Colombia is deeper and it has real people with real feelings and real stories behind, and they are exactly equal to all of us.
It's at the very end of his talk that Diego pulls up an image of a man working behind a sewing machine. The man has brown hair, a short buzz cut, a slight mustache, and glasses. A tape measure hangs over his shoulders. The man is Omar.
Omar gave me a gift as a grand finale, because Omar is the closing, very last slide of my talk.
That picture of Omar then fades into a video clip in which Omar and Diego sit side by side, an array of sewing machines in the background. Diego believes what Omar shares with him gets to the root of the Colombian conflict. Here's what Omar tells Diego.
Lo que yo aprendí se lo agradezco a algunas gentes que se llevaron allá, como ustedes. Ella la tuvimos nosotros retenida.
Omar says he's grateful to someone that his front, the FARC Front 41, kidnapped years ago, when Omar was 30-something years old. This woman was held by his front for almost a year. During her captivity, she taught not just Omar, but 15 to 20 other guerrilla soldiers. She taught them how to read and write, as well as other subjects such as math and spelling. She gave them an education that none of the soldiers had had access to before.
Y fue la primera profesora que yo tuve en la vida.
He says she was the first teacher he ever had in his entire life. Omar's story begs the question, what would Colombia look like if everyone had the same opportunities and privileges needed to better their lives? Another question, a more personal question from my point of view, what kind of conversations would we all have as Americans if we had the chance to go birding together?
So what happened is that after all this experience of the expedition, I have this story. I have this full circle. I went to Perijá 15 years ago, starting to do a biological expedition that never happened because I was kidnapped by FARC. And then today, in 2017, I had the chance to go again with FARC, to finish a biological expedition on very, very different terms. And that's what's the new Colombia about.
Diego continues to speak to audiences about the importance of the peace accord and reconciliation. He asks listeners to consider the various shades of gray that have created the heartbreaking conflict Colombia has endured. And he does all of this by sharing what it means to find peace through his passion, birdwatching. This episode of Shadow Clock was created by me. Assistant editing is by Alec Jansen. Post-production audio is by Matt Sorrow. Social media is by Kelsey Hayes and Alec Jansen. Music is credited to Pond5 and Premium Beat. Content contributors, composers, and individual song titles for each episode can be found on our website at shadow-clock.com. Kate Cosgrove creates original illustrations for each episode of Shadow Clock, which you can also see at shadow-clock.com. If you like the show, you can spread the word by telling someone else about Shadow Clock, and of course, by following us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Shadow Clock Podcast, on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Shadow Clock Pod, and on YouTube at Shadow Clock. I personally want to express just how much it means every time you give us a click, a like, a subscribe, or follow, and we love word-of-mouth endorsement. And I can't thank each and every one of you enough. Speaking of thanks, a special thanks goes out to Alejandro Velez, Adam Gould, Gustavo Bravo, Alec Jansen, Kate Cosgrove, Matt Sorrow, Josh Kobach, Johnny Messina, Bruce Sibley, Adam Zavaslak, Austin Krieg, Forest Hills Northern High School in Michigan, Arian Dada, Duro Howard, and Kelsey Hayes. Lastly, I want to thank Diego Calderon Franco for sharing his story with me. You can follow Diego and all his birding adventures on Instagram. We've included a link to his profile and bird tour company on our website. So, if you find yourself in Colombia, I highly recommend you take his birding tour. I can't wait to sign up for mine. And before we go, one more important thing. As we are an independent out-of-pocket podcast, creating this entire first season with zero funding, we very much welcome donations. You can make a donation on our website by going to shadow-clock.com and clicking on the donation button. Donating is one of the best ways you can help us continue to share these stories. And with that, I'm Katie Mahalik. This is Shadow Clock.